And it's showtime, folks. Good to see you, Jeremy. Good to see you, Longinus of Jerusalem, and anyone else who's watching. Yeah, I know it's a rather odd time. I'm doing this on a weekday, and that too at a time like this when I won't be expecting much of an audience. But anyway, people can still watch it after I'm done. So just pray for the session, guys. Pray for me. Pray for the connection. Pray that we don't run into any kinds of technical issues, electrical issues, or any kinds of attacks of any kind, because I've been waiting to do the stream for the past couple of weeks, but always kept getting delayed by something or the other. Is my mic good, guys? Hey, God bless you, Valerie. Good to see you. Is my mic good? Just want to see some feedback on my other laptop where the chat is on. Let me know. Is it loud and clear? Hey, Siddharth, good to see you, man. All right, cool. I'll dive into the topic then. Just share my screen. Good to see you, ENB. And hopefully, Lord willing, this is the final part of the series for Daniel. Just checking in if you guys can see my screen now. Is it visible? Just shared it on StreamYard. Here goes. Just a sec. Okay. So I wanted to revisit some linguistic objections, which I did mention sometime. I think it was in part 2 or part 3 that I'll touch base on it again. So it's got to do with the first 6 chapters of Daniel. It's something called as the objection from textual unity. So what liberal scholars want to say is Daniel was written in 2 parts. The first 6 chapters were written sometime around 320 to 300 BC, shortly after the conquest of Alexander the Great. And the next section of Daniel was written sometime around 165 BC. That is around the time of the Maccabean revolt. Okay, and that's their argument. And what's the basis behind that argument? They want to say that chapter 7 dates to the first year of King Belshazzar, who is mentioned in chapter 5, but chapter 6 is talking about Darius the Mede, who was Cyrus, which I talked about in part 1. So just to give you a rundown of this argument of theirs, just quickly open my notepad, just increase the size for the sake of the mobile users. Get that font size 24. So liberals argue Daniel was written in 3 parts. Written in 2 parts. Part 1, which is chapters 1 to 6. They argue it was written sometime around 320 to 300 BC. And then part 2, chapters 7 to 12, written from roughly 170 to 165 BC, or the Maccabean era. Why do they say that? They have a very weak argument. They say chapter 7 talks about Belshazzar again. When it's already spoken of, when it's already talked about in chapter 5. So, 2 different authors. Hey, Bewitched Prophet of Islam, good to see you. That's their argument. So two different authors. It was compiled in two parts by at least two different authors, or rather two different set of authors. Okay, and how will I tear this argument apart? It's quite simple, really. So now the problem with this argument is the language. If they are saying chapter 1 to 6 was written in the 300s, and then chapter 7 to 12 was written around 165 BC. Now there's a slight problem. Chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, that's written in Hebrew. Now, chapter 2, verse 4 onwards to chapter 7, that's written in Aramaic. And Daniel chapters 8 to 12, the last four chapters. Sorry, I made a typo again. My bad, excuse my typos. This is again written in Hebrew. So it can't be possible to say that chapter 7 is the start of a new composition. If you want to say that part 2 begins at chapter 7, then why is suddenly part chapter 7 starting in Aramaic, and then suddenly in chapter 8 it switches back to the Hebrew? Okay. Now they call this a weak argument, and even liberal scholars also concede to this, saying that you can't really say that Daniel chapter 7 can be part of the second composition of Daniel, rather part of the Maccabean composition. So even John J. Collins, who's a liberal scholar, just says linguistic considerations neither require unity of authorship for the Aramaic chapters, nor in themselves warrant a distinction between chapter 7 and the earlier chapters. Okay, so I'll just coming back to my notes. So just to put it simply forward, Daniel chapter 7 can't be part of the later dating, since 7 is in Aramaic, 8 is in Hebrew. Otherwise, saying that 7 to 12 is dated later is a weak argument. Because if you're saying a second author wrote 7 to 12, why would the author suddenly change writing 7 in Aramaic and then switch over to Hebrew in chapter 8? So that's the argument. That's how you just remove this argument, considering this unity. But that still creates a problem. So even if you could argue 7 was part of the original, then one can still say that 8 to 12 were written later. Okay, so that still leaves us with a problem. So just to recap, liberals say Daniel was composed in two parts across two different eras. Part 1, chapters 1 to 6, part 2, chapters 7 to 12. But there's a problem, because chapter 7 can't be part of this later dating, because chapter 7 is written in Aramaic, chapter 8 to 12 are in Hebrew. An author can't suddenly change suddenly over that. So then you could say 7 to 12 later is a weak argument. So even if you could argue 7 was part of the original Daniel, then one can still say that 8 to 12 were written later. Now there's another problem with this argument as well, because chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 3, that's written in Hebrew. And then chapter 2, verse 4 to end of chapter 7 is again in Aramaic. And chapter 8 to 12 is again in Hebrew. So that first theory saying that 1 to 6 was written first and then 7 to 12 written later, that doesn't make sense because of the way the languages are divided. But then it's still, people can still say, nah, maybe different authors wrote it at different points of time. But then how do we answer this argument? So coming back to our conservative scholarship, that is actual conservative scholarship, not our James Whites or Daniel Wallace or all these kind of guys. Take, for example, Gleason Archer. Now, he's making a certain point. He's made a point that certain parts in Daniel's book, that is from chapter 2, verse 4 onwards to chapter 7, it's dealing a lot with the king's court. Yes, Jeremy Wong, in the manuscripts which I've found, the language is actually really divided. The language is actually really divided, Jeremy. So now Gleason Archer has made a kind of a point. He's saying that chapter 1 until chapter 2, verse 3 was written exclusively in Hebrew because it was for the Jews, for a Jewish audience alone, whereas chapter 2, verse 4 to the end of chapter 7 was written in Aramaic because because it was more inclusive to Gentiles as well as Jews, since it was talking about Daniel's career most of the time within the king's court, within different kings, and so on and so forth. And then chapter 8 to 12 is again written in Hebrew because chapter 8 to 12, Daniel is writing prophecies of history. And also in chapter 12, that is the last chapter of the Hebrew Daniel, there's clearly a mention of the angel asking Daniel to shut up the words in this book and not to talk about it until a later time. So that just makes sense that chapter 8 to 12 was to be interpreted solely by a Jewish audience. That's why it just makes sense. And then another scholar on our side, Joyce Baldwin, she notes that the book bears so little trace of the allegedly differing viewpoints. As a literary work, it manifests unity of purpose and design. Okay. And another liberal scholar, he also gives in saying that Daniel has to be a unified work. There's no such thing as separate authorship in Daniel. Okay, there's one more thing about the chapter 1 to 7 argument I forgot to talk about. There is a kind of symmetry we see in the book of Daniel. Symmetry. SYMMETRY. A symmetric kind of structure wherein, like, say, similar events are kind of depicted across the first 7 chapters, especially you could say from chapter 2 to chapter 7. So, chapter 2 and 7, they're talking about the prophecies of the 4 kingdoms, okay, which are going to arise. That is the Babylonian kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, then the kingdom after him, which is the Medo Persian kingdom, then the kingdom after that, which is the Greek kingdom, and then finally you have the Roman Empire. And then Daniel 3 and 6, it's talking about persecution of Jews. And Daniel 3, it's talking about his 3 friends about to be thrown into the fire, and then an angel of the Lord, in this case, the pre incarnate Jesus, saves them in Daniel 3. And in Daniel 6, of course, the famous story of Daniel being thrown in the den. So it's got this chiastic structure, this kind of a symmetry which authors in the ancient Middle East used to write. Even if you look into our creation accounts in Genesis, even they follow a chiastic structure, which is again evidence that it's written by one single person and it's not written by many different people. Also, Daniel 4 and 5, it's comparing and contrasting the arrogance of the 2 kings. Daniel 4 is talking about Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, and then finally, Nebuchadnezzar, after calamity befalls him, he repents, recognizes Daniel's God as the true God. Whereas in Daniel 5, Belshazzar, the same thing happens, but Belshazzar unfortunately meets a very bad fate. So the symmetry is there, due to which they are saying chapter 7 can't be part of the later composition. And then when I was talking about that, still leaves out chapters 8 to 12. We have arguments coming both from conservative scholars as well as liberal scholars like Harold Henry Rowley. He also says the same thing, that Daniel has to be a unified composition. Although he agrees with the Maccabean date, that is the late date, he still has to say that it is a unified composition. Yes, Jeremy. Yeah, Genesis 6 to 9 is also kind of, it follows that chiastic kind of structure, and it's kind of all throughout the Pentateuch, actually, a lot of it. It just gives more sense that it was written by one person and not that crap JEPD hypothesis, which is just shoved down people's throats in seminaries and theological colleges. Now, what does this liberal have to say? He's saying a quality of mind or mental habit is not so easily borrowed. So, so what he's saying is it is written by a unified mind. So even if another author wants to come and imitate that kind of a person, even that is difficult. Like for example, if I have to copy Catholic Crusaders' writing style or Jeremy Wong's writing style, if I'm trying to copy it, that's not going to be very easy because I'm not going to think like them. So that's why he's talking about this thing. It is not easily borrowed. Not less so is the difficulty of finding any clear division, since the threefold test of language, form, and presumptive authorship yields different results, while Chapter 7 will continue to embarrass the dissectors by its refusal to be assigned to either half alone. So he's saying it's very difficult to put Chapter 7 in either half. If you want to claim it is Daniel 1 to 7 was the original composition, fine. But then it's again difficult with chapter 7 because you won't be able to put that in Daniel 1 to 7 and claim it's the original. And it's also difficult to put that exclusively in Daniel 7 to 12 and claim that's the second composition. So he's saying chapter 7, the placement of chapter 7 will only make sense if we assume that it is part of a unified whole. That's chapters 1 to 12. Okay. But we have this other liberal, John J. Collins. He's talking about some discrepancies existing in Daniel. Okay, some discrepancies. John J. Collins, on some sides, he agrees with us, but on other sides, he wants to get out really weak strawman kind of arguments. Rather, not strawman arguments, just he's just clutching at straws. He's claiming that there are still discrepancies. Now, this first discrepancy is this thing, the chronological setting of chapter 2. So I'll just come to chapter 2. The second year of Nebuchadnezzar is incompatible with the data of chapter 1, according to which Daniel had already completed a training period of 3 years, which had begun in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So what is this guy saying? Just coming back to my notes. Holland's arguments on discrepancies within Daniel. I spelled discrepancies correctly. Yep. So he's stating the first argument. Chapter 2 says, second year, that is the second year of Daniel's exile. All right, I'll just check the Bible just to be very clear about that. Let's have a look. Daniel 5, New KJV, Bible Gateway. Sorry, not Daniel 5. Why am I saying Daniel 5? Let's go to Daniel 2. Daniel 2. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Okay, so now it's telling about this thing. Now, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, approximately, if I'm just seeing the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, that's his name, historical figure, King Nebuchadnezzar II. When did he start reigning? Yeah, he started reigning around 605 BC, roughly 605 BC, just to give you guys the date. So, just to give you guys the date, Nebuchadnezzar started reign started 605 BC. The same year, he took the first set of Jews exile. And I kind of talked about that 605 BC argument in my second video. Okay, that 605 versus that 597 BC argument concerning the two exiles. Now, Daniel was taken with his friends during this exile. Note, that was around 605 BC. Okay, now chapter 2 here, it's starting with the second year of Nebuchadnezzar reign. So, Daniel chapter 2 starts with the second year of his reign. Now, if I'm saying second year of his reign, that is 604 BC, because we are going backwards, 604 years before Christ. So the timeline is backwards. If you're counting dates in AD, then the timeline we keep adding. But if you are adding dates in BC, then the timeline we keep subtracting. 604 BC. So that's the argument. But he's saying this is a problem because chapter 1 says Daniel and his friends were trained by the king, trained in the king's court for 3 years. Okay, which means end of 3 years will be 602 BC. But chapter 2 begins in 604 BC. Okay, instead of 602 BC. So this is a contradiction. Therefore, multiple authorship. Since author of chapter 2 had no idea about what the author of chapter 1 had written. You get the argument? This is the argument he has to make. These are the same stupid arguments people make against Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, saying that they are two contradictory creation accounts. No, that's not really the case. They are not two contradictory creation accounts. Chapter 2 is just expounding a bit more on the creation of man and the Garden of Eden, whereas chapter 1 doesn't talk about the Garden of Eden. Chapter 2 is just expounding on that. So if we examine this argument, that's what he wants to get at. And there's also some other variant reading. There is a variant reading we have. Like I said, we have different manuscript copies. Now this variant reading says that chapter 2 reads, it's Papyrus 967. In that chapter 2 reads, it's the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and not the second. So if you're saying the 12th year, but we have Papyrus, I think 967, which reads 12th year of Nebu's reign. Just put Nebu for short. Which mathematically speaking, if it's the 12th year, he started in 605. So 605 minus 12, that will equals 593 BC, roughly. Okay. And that kind of resolves it. So the problem is solved. But since it's only one papyrus, it may not be an authentic reading. So there is still a problem because he's saying just one manuscript which is telling that, so it's not an authentic reading. Okay, so how do we come to this? How do we vindicate this? Simple. This is not really a big problem, to be honest. It's possible that Daniel interpreted this dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 sometime during the 3 years of his training. This is not really a big deal. He's just making a mountain out of an anthill because there are several places in the Old Testament, like Genesis, Isaiah, Jeremiah, which have this kind of a structure. A past event is talked about more in detail in a future chapter. That's always the case. Or an event in the previous chapter is expounded in more detail in a newer chapter. This is something, uh, no, Valerian, I'm talking about the papyrus manuscript of our Bible, not our clay tablets. A papyrus manuscript of our Bible, actually, not the Babylonians. But yeah, I'm coming to the clay tablets and the cylinders. I'll be coming to that, the Nabonidus cylinders. Good point you raised up. Hey, good to see you, Akash. Faith Defender. Hey, God bless Emmanuel Shahid. So this thing is not a big problem, really. It's just our scholars just getting really, really, really desperate, giving up all nonsense arguments. Now, there's still a second issue this guy wants to bring up, John J. Collins. Now, the second issue is that in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar is a non existent king. That's number one. And number two is Belshazzar does not. Is not aware about Daniel's existence nor of the experience of his father. And he's also talking about another argument. He's saying chapter 3 omits Daniel. Now, chapter 3 is skipping Daniel because in chapter 3 it only talks about the persecution of Daniel's three friends. It doesn't say anything about where's Daniel. So, again, he just wants to say that maybe that thing was inserted by some other author. But this is just a speculation on his part. It's not really a big thing because there are several other places in the Old Testament where certain characters are not talked about. Like, for example, uh, in Genesis, you have the story of Judah and Tamar. That particular chapter was just had to do with Judah. But again, typologically speaking, it's got a lot of significance. And also, there's a chiastic structure over there as well, because it's just comparing and contrasting Judah's behavior with that of his behavior, Joseph, when it came to the sin of adultery and lust. It's just making a comparison over there between how Joseph behaved and how Judah behaved. And John J. Collins, despite archaeological evidence, just has to say that Belshazzar is allegedly the son of Nebuchadnezzar, allegedly, but I already proved that in part one, and I'll be talking more about Belshazzar here. Also, Belshazzar is not unaware of Daniel. That's what he's saying. Is not aware of Daniel. Sorry, I made another ridiculous typo. I'll just correct it here. Here we go. Sorry. It was unaware. I think I just need to have a bit more coffee today. Because Daniel 5:14 to 16, if you read that out, Belshazzar was aware of Daniel. He just had forgotten about him. That's it. Nothing more. So he's again making really weak arguments, John J. Collins. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide, which is just got to do with some good news, some positive evidence which we are getting from archaeology. I did cover some of that in part one, but I'll just continue and talk about it a bit more today. Now, archaeology is on our side. Okay. Oh, 4 a.m. New York. It is 10:40 p.m. here. Usually I go to bed by 10:30, 11 on weekdays. And today I think I'll be staying up a bit more late, finishing off the stream, which was overdue by a couple of weeks. Just kept getting some satanic attacks of some sort or the other, which kept me from making the stream. So please keep me in prayers. Spiritual warfare is real, guys. So I talked about Belshazzar and Daniel 5 was fiction now, but I didn't talk about the archaeology. Now we have some archaeological evidence called as the Nabonidus cylinders. There were four of them discovered, and they were constructed by Belshazzar's father, Nabonidus, sometime in 550 BC. That is 11 years before the fall of Babylon. And just to let you know, Nabonidus was an Abdul. He was a pre-Islamic Muslim who existed some 1100 years before Muhammad did. Why? Because he worshipped the moon god Sin in Ur. So you can say Muslims were right about Islam existing, but Islam was by no means the religion of the Jews, nor was it the religion of Abraham, because Nabonidus was a pagan Babylonian at the end of the day. And he's written that in his cuneiform text concerning his son. He is, oh, God bless you, Murray. Thank you so much. Likewise, all of you are also in my prayers. So, now about this cuneiform text. Now, Nabonidus himself is saying that he's talking about Belshazzar, his firstborn son. So, this is the case which disproved the skeptics' myth that Belshazzar was fiction because no historian talked about him. Once they found out this archaeological piece of evidence, he's talking about he's praying for a son, and who is he praying to over here? He's praying to his moon god Sin in Ur, who is some variant of Allah, the Islamic God, to tell you the truth. Let the fear of your great divinity be in his heart, and may he commit no sin. May he enjoy happiness in life. So he's praying to this God about his son. Now, besides this Nabonidus cylinders, there was another cylinder in Babylon, which also reads in this same cuneiform text, that when Nabonidus went on a long journey, he left Babylon, and that he entrusted his eldest son, whom we know to be Belshazzar, with the kingship. So Belshazzar was made kind of king or co-regent, as I mentioned earlier in video number 1. So I'm just giving out the archaeological details in this video and the scholarly accounts to vindicate this. And another scholar, Kenneth Kitchen, cites that in the late Babylonian Empire, Nabonidus was largely an absentee ruler. He was barely around. Why? Because he was so busy worshipping his Allah in his 17-year reign. For a majority of his reign, he was barely there. He was just there visiting Allah, and God knows, maybe kissing that black stone in Ur or wherever it was at that time. It was definitely not in Mecca, by the way. I don't know what he was doing in Ur instead of going all the way down to Arabia if the black stone supposedly existed over there. Spending 10 of his 17 years far southwest of Babylon, about 450 miles in and around Tema and in northwest Arabia. Remember, this is northwest Arabia. It's not the southern part of Arabia. You go down south, there you'll find Mecca, Medina, and the Black Stone. But this is northwest Arabia. This is the side of Arabia which is more closer to Israel and Iraq. And returning barely a year or so before Babylon's fall in 539. During that long span, that is 550 to 450 BC, The effective ruler in Babylon was in fact his son Belshazzar, as local documents attest, wherein oaths are sworn in the names of both men. Okay, although Belshazzar was made a kind of king, quote unquote king, a lot of local documents and oaths, Belshazzar was still putting his father's name over there besides his own. So officially, he was not king. He was kind of like an acting king. He he enjoyed the rights and powers of the king when his father was not there. So his father had in practice entrusted the kingship into his hand. Okay. Now another archaeologist says, now these specific details about Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, confirmed by ancient Babylonian sources, demonstrate the exceptional accuracy of the book about political matters in Babylon during the 6th century BC that were forgotten in the following generations. Why is that? Because in the next century, you had a historian called as Herodotus who had no idea who Belshazzar was. He assumed that Nabonidus was the last king. And the century after that, you had another historian called as Xenophon who also didn't have any idea about Belshazzar. He didn't mention him by name. So it makes all the more sense that this account of Belshazzar was more written closer by an eyewitness who's actually witnessed these accounts firsthand. That is a person who lived in the 6th century BC and who was aware about the political affairs going on in Babylon itself, and not some historian who comes like about a century later, less than a century later rather. Indeed, the fact that no Greek author or historian mentioned Belshazzar suggests that Belshazzar had been forgotten by the time of the Hellenistic period. Belshazzar's name is even missing from the king list of Babylon, please note, because he was never officially king. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who was a Jew who became a Roman citizen 1st century AD, lived in the generation of, say, the time the New Testament was being written, that is after the time of Jesus, but during the time of the apostles and the successors, the early fathers, that's when Josephus lived. So Josephus, this Jew, was also unaware of Belshazzar's existence and argued that Belshazzar may have been an alternative name for Nabonidus. So even here, this 1st century Jew, he was also a historian. He also didn't know that Belshazzar, he also couldn't find evidence for Belshazzar because it was not talked about by any Greek historian. So he was also ready to argue that Nabonidus was Belshazzar. And also in some of our Bibles, which are not up to date with archaeological evidence, even they have that footnote saying in brackets Nabonidus was another name for Belshazzar, which is kind of incorrect in some Bibles, including even the Dewey Reams, because they have not updated it archaeologically with that kind of footnote saying that Belshazzar was actually found and whatnot and so on. Hey Aladdin, good to see you, man. We haven't deleted any content of our channel. What are you talking about, Aladdin? I think you're looking at the wrong channel of Jeremy Wong, by the way. Jeremy Wong's other channel that's addressing heresies, Jeremy. We have actually replied to your argument, man. And I'll also be replying to your argument on 2nd Peter 1:1. We haven't finished replying to it, so just stay tuned. Okay? Have a coffee, man, and get back to work. Okay. Sorry about the distraction, guys. Coming back to the topic. James Montgomery. Now he's another liberal scholar who agrees with the Maccabean dating of Daniel. He's saying that he also agrees. He's also on our side with respect to this. Okay. The existence of a Belshazzar at the end of the Chaldean dynasty was strikingly demonstrated by the discovery of his name on the Nabonidus cylinder. Okay, in which he reappears as Nabonidus' son. Otherwise, Belshazzar had entirely disappeared from history except for the reference in Daniel 5 and the dependent reference in Baruch 1:1. So if you read the book of Baruch, where the Jews are asked to pray for the life of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, that is when they are in exile, and his son Belshazzar when they are in exile. Hey, good to see you, Ban. God bless you too. Oh yeah, guys, please don't forget to subscribe to Ben Beal's Corner if you haven't done so already. Amazing channel, good content, debates a lot of people as well, Unitarians, Muslims, and even has some good fruitful discussions with Protestants. Okay, so coming back, even liberals have to concede to that point that only Daniel knew about Belshazzar, not even secular historians or Greek historians, even they were silent about him. So he's saying where the Jews are bidden to pray for the life of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and for the life of Balthazar his son, which appears first sight to be an echo of Daniel. Now Daniel's knowledge of Belshazzar, it's pretty much a thorn for the late liberal Maccabean dating, because no historian knows about it. So even if some historians knew about Belshazzar, then what people would have said was that, okay, now since Herodotus talked about Belshazzar, or if say Xenophon talked about Belshazzar by name, so then our author of Daniel is just copying them, which is proof that Daniel was written late. But now since both of them are silent, they are compelled to admit that maybe this knowledge was known to somebody in the 6th century, but it's still not good enough for them to talk about Daniel being written early. Okay, at least for them. For us, it's more than good enough. Now, Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. There's some more archaeology which fits over here. Uh, I'll just come to the biblical story. Just get back to Daniel 5 and talk about what was happening. So, this happened at the fall of Babylon, just to give you some context. So, Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Okay, that is, he called all the nobles, the royal family, his courtiers, and etc. And he made a great feast, a party. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and concubines might drink from them. So now these gold and silver vessels were from the first Jewish temple, that is the Temple of Solomon, which Nebuchadnezzar had burned down sometime in 586 BC. And I'd made an argument about this father Nebuchadnezzar. Now, father in that context just meant predecessor. I talked about it in video 1. You can just have a look at video 1. Okay. Then they bought the gold vessels and these vessels, by the way, they were sacred. They were really sacred vessels because they were used in the temple for worship by the priests and the Levites. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, that is the temple of Solomon, the first temple, which had been in Jerusalem, and the kings and the lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. In other words, they defiled these sacred objects. Okay. They defiled these sacred objects. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, and wood and stone. In other words, they committed sacrilege. They committed sacrilege with these sacred objects which were used in temple worship. And just a side note to Protestants who think that maybe Catholics or Orthodox or any of the apostolic churches are too much into religion and stuff, that we follow some form of idolatry. That's not really the case, because certain things are meant for worship, relevance, adherence. So that's the thing here. And this was this guy's Belshazzar's undoing. In the same hour, now this is verse 5. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw part of the hand that wrote. So you had seen the thumbnail of my video today. It was talking about this thing. All right. Hey, Aladdin. Please don't distract. You can just sit quietly and listen. Ben Beal has already left, by the way. Just focus, guys. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And just to give you the heads up, yeah, Bob is a bit overrated. Just, just my opinion. Okay. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. So as soon as he saw this hand appearing out of nowhere and writing something on the wall, the king got scared. But he could not interpret the writing, therefore he had to call Daniel. Okay, so I'm just coming back. Now take a note of verse 5. Lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. This phrase, plaster of the walls of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Just this phrase here, plaster of the wall. Now, archaeology is again on our side. Archaeology demonstrates rather, sorry, I'll just fix this typo again. Demonstrates that Babylonian palace, that the walls of the Babylonian palace were covered in white plaster. And this is what archaeologists and scholars note. The circumstantial details suggest the testimony of an eyewitness because it's talking about the plaster of the wall. In this case, the king himself. The excavation of the palace has uncovered beyond three impressive courtyards a large room, which is 52 meters by 17 meters, which has become known as the throne room of the king. Inside the throne room and facing the doorway, a recessed niche in the wall probably indicates where the king's throne stood. One wall was adorned with a design in blue enamel bricks, but the other walls were covered with white plaster. There you go, guys. Okay, there you go. They were all covered with white plaster. Okay, which is consistent with verse 5. There's very intricate, minute details. Scripture has captured and archaeology has confirmed it. Throw these scholars out of the window. Okay? And even please argue with priests or pastors and any kind of people who buy this nonsense. Oh, this stuff was discovered quite recently, actually, in the 20th century, within the last century. Now, again, let's get back over here. Now, Daniel's interpretation of the writing, that is in Daniel chapter 5, same chapter, verses 26 to 28. It says that Babylon's fall was sudden and unexpected. It suddenly happened, the fall of Babylon at the hands of the Medo-Persian Empire. Okay? So, let's get back over here. Verses 26 to 28. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this was written, and in the inscription was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Uparshin. This is the interpretation of each word. That's what Daniel is saying. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. So he's talking to Belshazzar here. He's giving the interpretation. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. So the scales have found you wanting. Paris, your kingdom has been divided and has been given to the Medes and the Persians, that is the Mede-Persian Empire. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, and I kind of talked about that a bit in during video 1. So, to confirm this, we again have archaeology on our side. Another cuneiform document, Nabonidus Chronicle, that is another one, not the Nabonidus cylinder this time, but the Nabonidus Chronicle. It confirms this. It talks about in the month Tishri, when Cyrus fought on Opis on the Tigris River against a troop of Akkad. He destroyed the people with burning. He put the people to death. On the 14th day, Sippar was captured without fighting, and Nabonidus fled. Okay, so Cyrus had a battle with Nabonidus before, but not with Belshazzar, and this was battle in the open country. Now on the 16th day, Ukparu. Now Ukparu was one of Cyrus's generals. Ukparu, the governor of Gutium, and the troops of Cyrus entered Babylon without fighting. Without fighting. Like Daniel was saying, it was sudden and unexpected. They took Babylon without much of a fight. Afterward, when Nabonidus returned, and that time Nabonidus was not there in Babylon. Take note. Afterward, when Nabonidus returned, he was taken captive. He was taken captive in Babylon. So, in other words, when Babylon fell, Nabonidus was not there. Okay, according to this thing, Babylon fell, Nabonidus was not there. He had actually fought Cyrus in another battle and he had run away. But when Cyrus had taken over Babylon, Nabonidus was not there. Okay. Until the end of the month, the arms of Khutiab surrounded the gates of the temple Esagila. No one's weapon was placed in Esagila or the sanctuaries, and no appointed time was disregarded. In the month Markesu, and the third day Cyrus entered Babylon, were carried before him. Prosperity was established in the city. Cyrus decreed prosperity for all in Babylon. Cobyrus, his governor, placed governors in charge of Babylon. That is another governor, another general. From Kislev to Adar, the gods of Akkad and Nabonidus had brought up to Babylon, they returned to their cities. So the text does note that Nabonidus was missing when Babylon fell, but was later captured when he returned. The Nabonidus Chronicle also notes someone important died when Babylon fell, but doesn't mention the person who died. Now, someone important, if we corroborate with the Bible, Daniel chapter 5, it turns out it's Belshazzar. And if we know that Nabonidus was away and Belshazzar was king, according to the Nabonidus Chronicle, it's again Belshazzar. So here we go. Hey, God bless you, Marie. Please take care. In the month Marches one, on the night of the 11th, Ukparu, the governor in the month. So this text is unclear. Therefore, you see question marks of the king, something question mark of the king died when Ukparu took over Babylon. Ukparu, that is Cyrus's general. From 20th day of Adar to the third day of Nisar, there was weeping in the land of Akkad, all the people prostrated in their heads. So this question mark, the dash of the king died. So does it mean son of the king? Maybe. Okay. So liberal scholar James Montgomery first he kind of disagrees a bit, saying it just can't be Belshazzar, but then he just gives in, saying it could be Belshazzar, who is this important person who died, who is related, who is somewhat associated to the king. Who this personage was is quite doubtful. Most scholars, while recognizing the uncertainty, have filled the lacuna with the son of the king, that is Belshazzar. So, example, king bought in clay, bought flour, and dirty earlier, but the latter now does not venture to fill the gap. So, he's just talking. One of them doesn't want to fill the gap among these other scholars. So, he's claimed like three of these scholars, four scholars, king bought in clay, bought fire, and dirty earlier. He's saying this guy doesn't want to do it anymore among these five scholars, but finally he just gives in. Even this liberal gives in, saying that it could be Belshazzar who was this important guy. Accurate interpretation is impossible owing to the illegible condition of the text. As I said, the text on that chronicle, on this Nabonidus chronicle, is very unclear. This is what could be translated, the other stuff could not be translated. All right. But however, there is a strong probability that Belshazzar was slain in connection with the fall of Babylon, as indicated in the fifth chapter of Daniel and intimated by the record of Xenophon. Now, Xenophon was another historian who lived in the 4th century BC, that is 2 centuries after Daniel's time. So he recorded this thing in the 300s BC. So if we need to do addition of the different sources and just compare it with the Bible as the base, it just corroborates with the Bible. You don't have any other theories, any secularist theories, liberal theories just do not stand here. Also, besides this, we also have the Cyrus cylinder. Besides the Nabonidus Chronicle, besides the Nabonidus cylinder, besides Herodotus, besides Xenophon, we also have the Cyrus cylinder. Cyrus was instructed by the god Marduk. Now, this is Cyrus thinking to march against the city Babylon. Without any battle, he made him enter his town Babylon, sparing Babylon any calamity. So, again, Babylon's fall was sudden. If I'm just taking this thing, because if I'm just going back here, this is the interpretation of each word. Many God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and mounting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. This is Daniel interpreting the writing on the wall. And the last verse, that very night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, was slain that very night, and Darius the Mede, which I made a strong case is actually Cyrus the Great, received the kingdom being about 62 years old. There we go. It was sudden, and history also talks about it. Archaeology, actually. Xenophon, the Greek historian in the 4th century BC, writes in Cyropedia, that is his work, Cyropedia, the Persians diverted the Euphrates River. He also writes that the acting king, he doesn't name the acting king though, was killed following the fall of the city. What more evidence do you want? From other sources, we know that the acting king is Belshazzar. Daniel 5 narrates that Babylon fell the same night Belshazzar threw a party. Now, Daniel 5, verse 1, it's talking about Belshazzar throwing a kind of a party and inviting all his nobles, and then they started defiling the instruments and sacred vessels and cups which they used in the temple of God, that is first temple of Solomon. And they were having whatever, a drunken orgy, God knows what they were doing there. Okay? They were committing an act of sacrilege. He threw a party. And now this is again confirmed. Xenophon confirms this in Cyropedia, who notes that Cyrus chose to invade when he heard that a certain festival, so they were celebrating. The Bible records that festival as Belshazzar having a party had come around in Babylon, during which all Babylon was accustomed to drink and revel all night long. Revel, party all night long. So it was kind of a drinking festival. Okay, nowadays we have all this nonsense like, say, what do you call it, Mardi Gras, and all these other things like Oktoberfest, revel and drink all night long. Cyrus encouraged his men, Cyropedia 7:520 to 21. Let us therefore enter in with dauntless hearts, fearing nothing, and remembering that those against whom we are now to march are the same men that we have repeatedly defeated, and that too when they are all drawn up in battle line with their allies at their side, and when they were all wide awake and sober and fully armed. Whereas now we are going to fall upon them at a time when many of them are asleep, many drunk, and none of them in battle array. There, he clearly says that these guys are too busy partying, they are drunk, they are in no position to fight. So let's take over the city. Now's our chance. And when they find out that we are inside the walls in their panic fright, they will be much more helpless still than they are now. Herodotus also gives more details about this in his 5th century BC account. So this is Herodotus talking about how Cyrus took over. He writes a century before Cyropedia, the guy who wrote Xenophon. Cyrus posted his army at the place where the river goes into the city. So he actually talks about how Cyrus took over the city and another part of it behind the city. So he divided his army into two parts. one across the river and one behind the city, where the river comes out of the city, and told his men to enter the city by the channel of the Euphrates when they saw it to be fordable. Having disposed them and given this command, he himself marched away with those of his armies who could not fight. And when he came to the lake, Cyrus dealt with it and with the river. Just had the Babylonian queen drawing off the river by the canal into the lake, which was a marsh, he made the stream sink until its former channel would be forded. So he just divided the river in this kind of a way so that they could get into the city underground. When this happened, the Persians who were posted with this objective made their way into Babylon by the channel of the Euphrates, which had now sunk to a depth of about the middle of a man's thigh. So, because of that, they were able to cross the river without having to swim. They could, since it had just sunk to the middle of your thigh, they could just walk through it. Now, if the Babylonians had known beforehand or learned what Cyrus was up to, or they would have let the Persians enter the city and have just destroyed them utterly. If the Babylonians were aware that Cyrus and these guys were doing this, they would have actually let them enter the city and would have destroyed them. But since the Babylonians were too drunk, partying, having fun, enjoying themselves in orgies and whatnot, whatever, they were in no state to fight. Now, okay, they would have let the Persians enter the city and would have destroyed them utterly, for then they would have shut all the gates that had opened on the river and mounted the walls that ran along the river banks, and so caught their enemies in a trap. But as it was, the Persians took them unawares, and because of the great size of the city, those who dwell there say, those in the outer parts of it were overcome, but the inhabitants of the middle part knew nothing of it. So the outer parts of the city who were there, they were overcome, and the inhabitants who were in the middle part of the city, who were too busy partying, enjoying themselves, they were unaware of it. They knew nothing about what was happening outside. All this time, they were dancing and celebrating a holiday which happened to fall then until they learned the truth only too well. By the time they realized what was going on, too late. Babylon's taken over. However, despite all this evidence, we still have these idiots again clutching on to straws as usual. Now, some major objections. Now, they want to claim that the so called Maccabean era author of Daniel would have access to this information from Herodotus and Xenophon, like this stuff about how Babylon would have been taken over. But these historians who are closest to Belshazzar's era, that is both Herodotus, who was closest to Belshazzar's era, he wrote about 70 to 80 years after Belshazzar died, about 50 to 70 years roughly. And Xenophon wrote about close to 200 years after Belshazzar died. They are unaware about Belshazzar's name and existence. They are silent on Belshazzar's existence status and his co-regent status. Only Daniel talks extensively about Belshazzar, that he was a king in Babylon, and also about the fall of Babylon, which was sudden, also about the writing on the wall, the plasters, the white plasters in which the king's palace was covered. Neither Herodotus nor Xenophon talk about all this. So, what's the liberal objection? Now, the liberals want to object this way. They want to say that Belshazzar was actually outside of Babylon when it fell at the hands of the Medo Persians, that Belshazzar was not actually inside Babylon. So we have this liberal scholar, Paul Alain Paulo, notes the following. Paulo or Paulio, excuse me if I am butchering this guy's name. He's saying Belshazzar is attested after Nabonidus' return in two types of sources, in the prayers appended to inscriptions 16 and 17, and in these three archival texts dated to the end of the 14th year. So he's claiming that Belshazzar is actually stationed outside of Babylon when Babylon fell, so Daniel is wrong. So two of the three archival texts yield more information as to the role of Belshazzar after Nabonidus' return. CD 56 429 and Niben 824 from Sipar mention the son of the king in interesting context. Son of the king, that is, he's saying is Belshazzar. Both are lists of travel equipment such as garments, shoes, and foodstuffs allotted to various individuals who are dispatched to the son of the king. So apparently Belshazzar was alive and stationed outside of Babylon, was in charge of transporting some travel equipment. So Daniel 5 is false. Belshazzar was not in Babylon. So they're just making a really dumb assertion here, a really dumb assertion. Now, if you're actually looking at the sources and not this guy's assertions, now he's saying that he was outside of Babylon, but the actual text, when you're actually examining the actual texts which he's referring to, they only say a son of Nabonidus, but they do not give which son of Nabonidus. Nabonidus, it could have been another son of Nabonidus. It's not Belshazzar's son. What it's saying, travel provisions which have been given to Danu Nergal and Amurabni, who took a well arranged basket to the son of the king, month Sabbath today, 15th, 14th year of Nabonidus, king of Babylon. Okay. Beginning of NBN 824, travel provisions which have been given to Danu Nergal and Abu Bibni, who took a well arranged basket to the son of the king, month Sabbath today, 15th, 14th year of Nabonidus, king of Babylon. Now, when I talked about the Nabonidus cylinders in slides 59 to 60, they clearly indicate that Belshazzar was stationed in Babylon when Nabonidus was away. So this thing is definitely not talking about Belshazzar, it's talking about another son of Nabonidus. Now, it can be another son of Nabonidus because kings in those times, they used to have wives, concubines, a complete harem, and then probably 50 to 100 children. So this is really a weak argument. Also, the Cyrus cylinder and Xenophon, the historians' work when pieced together with the Nabonidus cylinders clearly favor Daniel 5. Okay, so now who is this other son which these guys are talking about who was outside of Babylon around the time Babylon fell? Simple. Very little is actually known of Nabonidus' children, frankly speaking. We only knew Belshazzar existed apart from the Bible in 1854 when they discovered the Nabonidus cylinders. Okay. Furthermore, we only know Nabonidus had at least three daughters, and the three daughters are mentioned by names: Enigaldinana, Ina Esagila Ramat, and Akabu Bunma. So these are some three daughters of Nabonidus, and there is also some evidence of a fourth daughter whose name is uncertain. We only know the names of these daughters, but we don't know what they did, their biographies, or the positions they held. Also, not much is known of the three named daughters either. It is highly likely that Nabonidus had other sons besides Belshazzar. Why am I saying that? Because kings in those times used to take multiple wives, multiple concubines, and easily. And in the Nabonidus cylinder, he clearly gives Belshazzar a distinction. He calls him his eldest and the firstborn son, whom he placed in charge. In other words, this liberal is again just clutching at straws by claiming that he was stationed outside when in fact it could have just been another son. All other historical evidence points to Belshazzar being inside Babylon and ruling Babylon when Nabonidus was away. So this guy is just the outlier and he could just be quoting another son who is not important enough to be named. Now, there's one more thing about archaeology. Now, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2, this is one of the prophecies of Daniel. Daniel chapter 8, verse 2. And I, Daniel, saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. Elam is a part of Persia. Persia is Iran. Susa, that's the name of a city. Now, Greek and Roman historians say that Susa or Shushan was reassigned to a new province named Susiana. Okay. Now, the Elam province, which was bigger, was now reduced to the region west of the Ulius River. Now, why is this important? Only Daniel knew this fact. It is reasonable to conclude that only a very early author would have known that Susa was once considered to be the part of Elam, and in Daniel's time it was part of Elam. Later it was reassigned to a new province named Susiana. Only an author who was aware about the political affairs and matters of his day and age concerning Susa would know this fact. If Daniel actually got this fact wrong, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 2, then people would just assert that this is a Maccabean date. But Daniel didn't get it wrong. He got this thing about Susa being part of Elam correct, at least in his time. So this is again clear-cut evidence that Daniel was written by Daniel in the 6th century BC, in the Neo-Babylonian period and the early Medo-Persian period. All right, and one more additional argument. These guys are just clutching at straws and trying to do a tap dance, to use word. Nothing else. Nothing else. These guys are big losers. One more thing. The author of Daniel is also well acquainted with Babylonian culture because he's familiar with their numbering system, sexagesimal numbering system. Now, that is based on number 6 and number 60. So when we use our numbering systems, we use decimal numbering system, just a bit of mathematics. We use a decimal numbering system where say 10 is important. So if I say 10 to the power 1, I get tens place. Then if I say 10 to the power 2, I get the hundreds place. 10 to the power 3, I get the thousands place. Okay, so every time I reach 9 and I get 10, then the moment I reach 99, the number of digits keep increasing, 100. Then I have 999, 1000. So this is what we do to interpret our numbers. We use the decimal system, but Daniel was clearly using a sexagesimal system when he was talking about Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold. His height was 60 cubits and its breadth was 6 cubits. He's talking in terms of 6 and 60s, whereas we talk in terms of tens. So Leon J. Wood remarks, it should be noted that the figures 60 and 6 suggest that the sexagesimal system was in use rather than the decimal. These numbers then provide a mark of authenticity because Babylon actually employed this sexagesimal system back in the day. And archaeological evidence just asserts this even more, even if Herodotus, Xenophon, and early historians were silent about this because they would not be knowing these details about the culture. It's only possible for someone who would have lived in that time to know details about that culture, or if someone was an archaeologist. And I doubt that the so-called fictional Maccabean author of Daniel was an archaeologist. Again, these guys are just refuted. Now, besides all these arguments, there's some more, at least half a dozen other arguments which I can bring forth, but I don't really consider them strong arguments because people can use them even the other way, saying Daniel would have known about this. I only pointed at arguments at an information which a 2nd century author would not have known, okay, from previous historians. A 2nd century BC author would not have known from previous historians. All the more to indicate the fact that Daniel was written by a single person, i.e., the prophet Daniel in the 6th century BC. So this brings me to the conclusion of the series. Hope you guys were edified. And if the Lord wills, next year I'll be looking at some topics like these to cover series on from time to time, again, God willing. So please keep me in prayers, keep these sessions in prayers, guys. Pray for me. I'll continue to pray for you guys. May the Lord bless us, heal us, keep us, give us the grace to be faithful to Him, walk with Him in integrity in our daily lives. Give us the strength and the grace of the Spirit to not deny Him before men. And help us, Lord, to live like proper Christians. Make this prayer to Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you so much, guys. God bless you. And prayers as always. Catch you guys later. See you. God willing, day after tomorrow. Bye.